contracts are essential. They're very important for resource-rich countries like Ghana, especially for the fact that we lack the technology and the financing to be able to exploit the resources on our own. If you want to drill a well, for example, you need about $50 million to do that. And that capital requirement, inhibits countries from exploiting the resources on their own. And also the fact that we do not produce the technology locally, we are not able to do that on our own. So contracts becomes very crucial, and the link between states and where the capital is, the investors, because somebody has the technology, he has the money, and you need to connect with that side of the equation to be able to exploit the resources. And that's how contracts become so important for resource-rich countries like Ghana. So for contracting in Ghana, we have seen three regimes or three eras. A period where we invested so much money into exploitation or exploration, trying to see what we can do with our own resources. So we set up GNPC, we gave them financing, we supported them with the technical capacity they needed, and it didn't achieve much. So somewhere around 2001, we decided to make a shift to see how we can, rather than invest in our own money, get private companies to come in. So an era of active campaign to attract investment began around 2001 and beyond. And that is how come we got the Cosmoses and the Talos to come in. And of course, they also made use of our own investments through GMPC, gathering data about our basins. And that brought in the Cosmoses and the Talos. And then we got to an era where we were successful. We made discovery, a commercial discovery, I must say. So after that, then the risk in our basins reduced, because once you discover oil, then companies now know that you have the capacity to produce oil. So after discovery of oil also, we continue to attract investors. So those are the three broad areas that we have had in our petroleum contracting process. So the report that we did actually was to assess the active contracts that we have currently, aside those that are producing. We have three producing blocks, so those were not our focus, but to see the contracts that are active and not producing, to see whether they are performing to be able to add on to our reserves, to be able to add on to oil production, because the essence of giving blocks is to ensure that the companies can produce oil. So we wanted to assess to see whether these companies are delivering their minimum work obligation, because within every contract are set standards that you have to meet, set benchmarks that you have to meet. So that is what this report actually sought to do. And within the contracting space, we have institutions that helps ensure that the state's interest is served. So you have the Ministry of Energy, which has the primary responsibility. We have Cabinet, we have Parliament, we have the Petroleum Commission, and of course, GMPC in there. So when you look at the role of the Ministry of Energy, it has the primary responsibility, as I said, to award the contracts. So the minister receives the applications and reviews the applications with his technical people. And under the old regime, where we had the PNDC Law 84 as the industry law, we used the administrative procedure. And the administrative procedure was that first come, first serve. So once you come to the minister to apply for a particular block, the minister takes you through the process. And no other company has the opportunity to compete for the same block. So it limited Ghana's capacity to see what the other companies also had to offer. Because there was no competition for the blocks, they gave the blocks out on first come, first serve basis. But that, changed last year, where after several advocacy and engagement with government and realization that having discovered oil, we needed to open up the process and make it more transparent and competitive. So we passed the new E&P Act, which introduces competitive tendering process to ensure that we no longer use the first come, first serve administrative process, but rather we ensure that there's competition for blocks to engineer greater value for Ghana. We also have cabinet, and the role of cabinet is to ensure that what the minister has negotiated can be transformed into a government position. So they will assess the contract and adopt it before it goes to Parliament. So the minister will have to send a memo to cabinet explaining why Ghana should commit itself into a contract with a foreign entity or with any private entity. So the memo would detail out the benefit for Ghana and benefit for the business and what we stand to gain as a result of entering into that engagement with a private entity. And then we have Parliament. Parliament, as our representatives, will also have to approve, and that, power is granted to them by the Constitution. Article 268 of the Constitution requires that all resource contracts are approved by Parliament. So Parliament has that constitutional duty to ensure that what the executives sign up to, what the executives agree with private investors, are in our collective interest, are actually deals that are serving all our interests. So Parliament has that mandate to approve whatever the executive decides on, as far as contracting the petroleum sector and resource contracts in general are concerned. But we have seen challenges with the way those things are done. Even though they are our representatives, they don't seek our opinion on all these contracts. And that has been a trend we've been worried about over the years. They don't request for memos, they don't ask citizens to make inputs, and they rush contracts through, and you don't see much due diligence done on these contracts to ensure that we have value for money and we have capable companies to help exploit the resources. And GMPC also plays a role. In the past, in the past regime, GMPC was virtually a player and a referee at the same time. They were a regulator and a commercial player as well. But we changed that trend after discovery by establishing the Petroleum Commission and focusing GMPC on its commercial role to ensure that they can be an operator into the future, to build their capacity and competencies to be able to produce oil on their own. So now GMPC doesn't do any regulatory activities, but they focus on their commercial role. But technically and tacitly, if you look at it, GMPC still maintains certain regulatory function to the extent that they are part of the contracts, they serve the state's interest, and if you are part of a contract, they have a responsibility to ensure that the parties perform on those contracts. They have to ensure that they are delivering the interest of the state. So legally, they may not have that regulatory function, but because they are part of the agreements, they are part of the contracts, they are supposed to ensure that our interest is served. And of course, the Petroleum Commission was subsequently established to take up the regulatory function. And their capacity is also evolving to ensure that they deliver on their role, monitoring the entire value chain of the upstream sector to ensure that companies comply. They monitor the companies to deliver on their contracts. They also serve as advisor to the energy minister, which is a crucial role to assist the minister to be able to evaluate the contracts that we engage companies on, and to ensure that these companies deliver value to Ghana through local content and permitting and authorization processes. So the PC has become an independent authority in the industry to ensure that we can separate commercial interests from regulatory function. So looking at the contracts that we have today, We have a total of 14 active contracts beyond the Tullow, the Cosmoses, and the ENIs who are producing oil today. And of the 14, 12 of them are in the western basins. That is the western part of Ghana, the western region. And that constitutes about 20% of our basins. That means that we still have significant part of Ghana's hydrocarbon basin unexplored. So we still need a lot more contracts. We still need to engage a lot more companies to be able to explore the rest of our basins. And when we looked at the PAs, only one of them was actually signed before oil discovery in Ghana. That is the Hess block. Beyond that, the 13 of them were post-discovery contracts. So in every contract, there are what we call exploratory period. There is a period where you are allowed under the contract to find oil or relinquish the block. So it ranges between, in Ghana, 6 and 7 years. So within that 6 and 7 years, you have to find oil or you leave the block. So we don't give you for the 30 years, even though that is the period that will be agreed in the contract. You have the exploratory period for 6 to 7 years. But even within that 6 and 7 years, we stagger it to ensure that we can track the performance of the company. So you would often find 3 periods within that exploratory phase. So we have what we call the initial phase or the initial period, and then there is a first extension, and then there is second extension to cover the exploratory period. So for the minimum work obligation, or what you're supposed to deliver in your phase, or first, second, and third phase, there is a minimum obligation on the contractor to deliver. So if you take the first phase, for example, there are specific activities that will be agreed in every contract. In some of the contracts, government will say you have to spend $30 million on the block for the first phase. In some, $50 million, some $80 million. So if you fail to deliver on that minimum work program, there are sanctions that come with it. For example, in the contract, you will find a statement like this: work accomplished in any period in excess of the above obligations may be applied as credit in satisfaction of obligations called for in any other period. Without prejudice to Article 23(3), should contractor fail to perform its minimum work obligation under Article 4(2), as applicable, contractor shall pay to GMPC an amount equal to the unspent amount of the minimum expenditure obligation for the relevant exploration phase. What this means is that if you are supposed to spend $50 million in a phase or in an exploratory phase, and you are able to spend $60 million, what that means is that you have overspent by $10 million. So they will credit you with the $10 million in your subsequent phase. But if you fail to deliver on that and say spend $10 million instead of $50 million, you have to pay the difference of $40 million to GMPC as a sanction to ensure that you are not just holding on to the block, but you are actually performing your duties on the block. And that is to avoid speculation on the block. Because in the oil industry, what companies do is that they will come and take the block, they will not work, and waiting to see who is discovering around them so that they can sell the block, make money, and go away. But you try to put in some of these measures to ensure that companies are not holding on to the block without spending. So you find these clauses in the contract to tie the hands of companies to ensure that they deliver on the contract. So what we did was to assess compliance with the minimum work obligation of the contracts that we have signed. And our assessment showed that only one of the companies has actually complied with their minimum work programs out of the 14. And some of them were lucky to have had the ITLOS preliminary ruling, which placed an injunction on the disputed area along our border with Ivory Coast. But even those who were not affected by the IDLOS ruling, our analysis show that they also did not meet their minimum work obligation. So we can infer that even without the IDLOS ruling, some of these companies will still not have been able to satisfy their minimum work program. And we did, the estimates of how much they were supposed to spend on those blocks. So if you look at the PAs that we have signed, the expenditure program for the first phase of all the contracts sums up to $923 million. So between 2 and 2.5 years, these contracts were supposed to deliver an investment into Ghana's waters, $923 million US dollars. And if you take those whose initial period has expired, the total amount should be around $750 million, which means that they should have sunk wells, gathered data to the tune of $750 million. But if you look at it, just about 2% of that amount has been spent so far, which means that they are not active. They are not delivering on their minimum work program and obligation. For example, even if you isolate those who were affected by IDLOS, GMPC should be claiming about $150 million from the companies who were not affected because they are not delivering on their minimum work obligation. But nobody is acting to ensure that those sanctions apply. And surface rental is, I should say it's peanuts that the companies are supposed to pay as a token for holding on to the blocks. So the fees are maybe $50 per square kilometer square, which is not much. And the Auditor General estimates that as of 2016, the default rate had reached $1.5 million with the surface rentals. But we also estimate that if you apply penalties to those defaults, the companies are supposed to pay us $40 million. Because in the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, which applies to surface rentals, the PRMA section 3.4 states that where the liability of an entity to make a payment is not discharged on or before the due date, the entity shall pay as a penalty an additional 5% of the original amount for each day of default, or the default rate established under any other law, whichever is higher. So when you default in paying your surface rental, you're supposed to pay 5% of that as penalty every day for the default. And if we calculate that, by end 2016, the amount due to the Petroleum Holding Fund from defaulting on surface rental alone is $40 million. But we are not chasing after that money. We can go on. Yeah. Oh, I think you skipped it. Okay, so we are seeing from the analysis the reasons why these companies are not performing. And it actually confirms some of the things we have been saying, even when the contracts were being awarded, that fundamentally the companies are incapable. They lack the capacity to deliver on the terms of the contract. They don't have the money, they don't have the technology. And that is why they are not delivering. And we have also not responded in equal measure to ensure that the contracts are better governed. And because there is no competition for the blocks, it allows inefficiency and these incapable companies to come in. And then also parliamentary oversight has been a challenge, because even when you are led parliament that these companies are not showing the right competencies to deliver on the block, you don't get any response to check that. And over the years, that's why we have signed these incapable companies on our waters, and they are not delivering. And we also see political patronage. The companies are not delivering, and yet they are getting extensions. Like I mentioned, if you fail to deliver on your minimum work program, you are supposed to pay at least a penalty before an extension is granted. But the companies are getting the extensions without delivering on the minimum work obligation. So what is actually informing those kinds of extensions without paying the penalties, without paying your surface rentals, and you are still getting the extensions. And that is a worry that we find with the way the contracts are managed. So our findings are that the companies are not capable. And then some also had, a safe haven in the 8 loss ruling, and therefore they are hiding behind that to buy more time for themselves. And also the administrative process of awarding contracts did not help us. It glorifies inefficiency and actually provided an impetus for these small companies, inefficient companies, to come into Ghana after we discovered oil, which requires that we change the trend quickly. And therefore, if you don't have these capable companies producing and they are not delivering, then the national objective of producing more oil, discovering more oil, is also deferred, because the companies are just sitting on the block. They are not exploring, they are not spending, and they are not making any discoveries. So if you are hoping that you get more oil to finance development, then you're only lying to yourself. So what we have recommended is that immediately government should review all their PAs and to assess those that have to be cancelled and cancel them. And those that have to pay penalties to stay on the job should pay immediately. And that is our first recommendation that we are making. And we're also saying that the future PAs or petroleum agreements should detail the specific timelines, even within the phases. Because if you say deliver 30 million in your first phase, and you don't time it within the 2 years or 1.5 years, they can sit down to the last minute towards the end of the period, and then they start analyzing data. They start gathering data and tell you, oh, we are busy gathering data. But if you program them to deliver a well-spread activity over the period, that would enhance tracking and monitoring of compliance with the contracts. And GMPC should also play its part of monitoring the partners. They are part of the agreement. So why are companies sitting idle and not working? We need GMPC to be active in delivering its part of the monitoring, the tacit monitoring that I mentioned in those contracts. And the Petroleum Commission should also have a parent monitoring system. Ordinarily, if citizens had access to this data to see how the contractors are performing, we could be asking the questions as and when they come. It wouldn't have to take ASAP to wait after all this period before we issue a monitoring report to see how the companies are performing. We need the Petroleum Commission to open up the process, to engage citizens, to also help all of us be part of the monitoring of the contracts. And then the new E&P Act needs to be implemented as soon as possible without any delay. We agree that the regulations are being developed, but it's being delayed, and we need government to act quickly to develop the regulations so that subsequent contracts will not be awarded through an administrative process, but through competitive tendering process.